Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1903 in West Virginia's Appalachian region was particularly severe. Record snowfall had isolated many of the small mining communities scattered throughout the mountains, cutting them off from neighboring towns, sometimes for weeks at a time. Temperatures regularly plummeted below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing pipes and forcing families to huddle around wood stoves for warmth. The Monongahela River partially froze, disrupting coal shipments and creating economic hardship throughout the region. Local newspapers from the period describe it as the harshest winter in living memory, with snow accumulations reaching 6 feet in some mountain hollows. It was during this bitter winter that the events surrounding Elijah Whitmore and the small community of Blackwell Hollow first came to light. Blackwell Hollow itself was a settlement of approximately 250 souls, established in 1867 following the discovery of a rich coal seam in the surrounding hillsides. Like many such communities, it existed primarily to serve the needs of the Blackwell Coal Company, which owned not only the mine, but also the company's store, most residential structures, and even the small chapel that served as both church and meeting hall. The town occupied a narrow valley between two steep ridges, with a single road connecting it to the larger settlement of Harper's Ferry, some 15 miles to the east. In winter, this road frequently became impassable, leaving Blackwell Hollow effectively cut off from the outside world. The town followed the typical layout of Appalachian mining communities of that era: a main street lined with the company store, a small hotel for occasional visitors, the doctor's office, and a few modest businesses. Behind these structures spread rows of nearly identical company houses, simple two-room dwellings that housed miners and their families. At the northern end of the valley stood the mine entrance, marked by a timber frame head house and accompanying processing structures. The southern end featured slightly larger homes occupied by the mine management, the company doctor, and a few skilled tradesmen. It was, by all accounts, unremarkable in its configuration, one of hundreds of similar communities that dotted the West Virginia hills during the height of the coal boom. According to county records dated February 1903, Elijah Whitmore was a respected physician who had established his practice in Blackwell Hollow around 1889 after relocating from Richmond, Virginia. His credentials, verified by state medical authorities, indicated training at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, followed by a brief tenure at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. His academic record, preserved in state licensing documents, showed particular interest in neurological disorders and respiratory diseases, specializations that would serve him well in a mining community where both injuries to the nervous system and lung ailments were common. Why a physician of such pedigree would choose to establish himself in a remote mining community remains a matter of speculation, though contemporary accounts suggest he often spoke of a desire to serve where the need was greatest. A letter of introduction he presented to the Blackwell Coal Company management, dated August 1889, expressed his interest in studying and treating the unique medical challenges presented by mining communities, particularly the chronic respiratory conditions associated with coal dust exposure. His reputation as a skilled doctor had grown steadily over the years, particularly for his innovative approaches to treating miners suffering from what was then called black lung disease. Local newspaper archives from the Harper's Ferry Gazette describe him as a gentleman of science, with a demeanor both serious and charitable. A profile published in the Gazette's Christmas edition of 1896 noted that Whitmore had established a small research laboratory adjacent to his clinic, where he conducted investigations into respiratory ailments and their treatments. The article praised his dedication to improving the health of the mining community and mentioned that he frequently traveled to medical conferences in Baltimore and Philadelphia to share his findings. Physically, Whitmore was described in various accounts as tall and lean, with piercing gray eyes, and a full beard kept meticulously trimmed. He dressed formally, even in the rural setting, typically wearing a black frock coat, waistcoat, and bow tie. His manner was characterized as reserved but not unfriendly, more given to listening than speaking. Several sources mention his unusual voice, soft yet penetrating, with precise diction and occasionally archaic phrasing that suggested his upbringing or education had been somewhat unconventional. Socially, he maintained a certain distance from the community while still fulfilling his professional obligations admirably. Unlike many small-town doctors of the era, he did not participate actively in community gatherings or church services. He was never known to marry or express romantic interest in anyone in the community. His few known associates included a small circle of academic correspondents with whom he exchanged letters regarding medical research, and occasionally the mine management with whom his professional duties required interaction. His home, situated at the edge of town on Ravens Ridge Road, was more substantial than most dwellings in Blackwell Hollow, a two-story colonial-style structure that had previously belonged to the mine's founding engineer. Whitmore had purchased it outright rather than renting from the company, an unusual arrangement that reflected both his financial means and his desire for independence. The property included several outbuildings, including a small stable for his horse and carriage, and what was referred to in property records as a research annex, presumably the laboratory mentioned in the Gazette profile. Yet, beneath this veneer of respectability lay something far more disturbing. The first indication that something was amiss came on February 12, 1903, when Whitmore failed to respond to an emergency at the Blackwell coal mine. A collapse in one of the deeper tunnels had trapped 3 miners, and, according to standard procedure, the company doctor was to be summoned immediately. According to the mine supervisor's log, preserved in the company archives now housed at the West Virginia State Historical Society, a runner was sent to Whitmore's residence, a substantial 2-story colonial-style home located approximately 1 mile from the town center on Ravens Ridge Road. The runner, identified in the records as Thomas Burke, reported that despite repeated knocking, no one answered the door. What made this particularly unusual was that smoke was visible from the chimney, and Whitmore's horse and buggy were still in the stable behind the house. Additionally, Whitmore was known for his punctuality and dedication to his patients. In the 14 years he had served the community, he had never before failed to respond to an emergency call. Concerned, Burke peered through the frost-covered windows but could see nothing in the dimly lit interior. After consulting with the mine foreman, a decision was made to force entry into the home, fearing that perhaps the doctor himself had fallen ill or suffered some accident that rendered him unable to respond. Burke, accompanied by 2 other miners, broke a small pane of glass in the back door and reached through to unlock it. The men entered cautiously, calling out for the doctor as they moved through the kitchen and into the main portion of the house. The interior was warm from the fire still burning in the hearth, but unnaturally quiet. No response came to their calls. No creaking of floorboards overhead indicated movement on the second floor. The account of what was discovered inside the Whitmore residence comes primarily from a sworn statement given by Sheriff Malcolm Hayes to the county clerk on February 15, 1903. The document, preserved in the state archives and later examined by historical researcher Dr. Harold Perryman in 1962, describes a scene that defies simple explanation. The home was in perfect order. No signs of struggle or disturbance were evident. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, and a half-finished meal sat on the dining table, apparently abandoned mid-consumption. The food was cold, but showed no signs of spoilage, suggesting it had been left no more than a day earlier. A medical journal lay open on the table beside the plate, a pencil marking a passage about electrical activity in brain tissue. Most peculiarly, Whitmore's medical bag sat open on his desk in the study, various instruments arranged in a precise pattern that one deputy described as resembling some sort of strange geometric design. The instruments included standard medical tools, stethoscope, thermometer, scalpels, but also several devices of unknown purpose fashioned from copper wire, glass tubes, and what appeared to be electrical components. The study itself presented a scene of methodical organization. Bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with medical texts, scientific journals, and bound volumes of research notes. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with precisely arranged papers, diagrams, calculations, and what appeared to be observational notes. A locked cabinet in one corner, when forced open by the sheriff, revealed an extensive collection of electrical instruments, many of them modified in ways that suggested specialized purpose rather than standard medical application. But Elijah Whitmore himself was nowhere to be found. The men conducted a thorough search of the property. Every room in the house was examined. Closets were opened, the cellar inspected, even the attic space accessed via a trapdoor in the ceiling of the second-floor hallway. No sign of the physician was found. No clothing appeared to be missing from his wardrobe. His valise and traveling coat remained in their customary places by the front door. Most telling was the absence of any footprints in the fresh snow surrounding the house. The only tracks visible were those made by Thomas Burke during his approach to the front door, and later around to the windows. The rear door remained locked from the inside until the search party forced entry. It was as if the doctor had simply vanished from within his sealed home. Sheriff Malcolm Hayes was summoned from Harper's Ferry the following morning. A career lawman with 23 years of experience, Hayes had a reputation for thoroughness and skepticism. His initial assumption, noted in his report, was that Whitmore had likely left the property before the most recent snowfall, and that the burning fire had been left as a precaution against freezing pipes during his absence. This theory, however, failed to account for the half-eaten meal, the lack of any indication of planned travel, and the fact that no one in the small community had seen the doctor leave. This alone would have been mysterious enough to warrant investigation, but what elevated the case to truly disturbing proportions were the discoveries made in the following days, as Sheriff Hayes conducted a more thorough examination of Whitmore's residence and possessions. In the doctor's study, behind a false panel in his bookcase, Hayes discovered a journal bound in what was initially described as unusual leather. The texture and appearance of the binding material were never officially identified, but Hayes noted in his report that it had an unsettling quality that prompted him to handle it with gloves. Later analysis conducted at the State Crime Laboratory in Charleston determined that the material was indeed leather, but of an unidentified origin that matched no known animal species in their reference collection. The journal contained entries dating back to 1889, the year of Whitmore's arrival in Blackwell Hollow. The earliest entries appeared benign enough: clinical observations, treatment notes, and occasional personal reflections. They painted a picture of a dedicated physician facing the challenges of rural medicine with ingenuity and compassion. An entry from September 1891 reads, "Treated young Thomas Harker today for severe respiratory distress following 3 years of mine work. Though only 17, his lungs show the characteristic scarring of prolonged coal dust exposure. Conventional treatments offer little hope. I have administered a tincture of my own devising, combining traditional remedies with certain chemical compounds that I believe may reduce inflammation of the bronchial passages. Will monitor progress closely." Subsequent entries tracked Whitmore's growing interest in the physiological effects of coal dust on lung tissue and his expanding research into respiratory ailments. By 1895, his notes indicate the establishment of a more formal research program with detailed case studies and experimental treatments documented with scientific precision. However, entries beginning in late 1896 took on a markedly different character. Whitmore's handwriting became increasingly erratic, alternating between precise, measured script and frenzied scrawls that sometimes tore through the page. The content shifted from medical observations to what can only be described as philosophical ruminations on the nature of human consciousness and what he referred to as the threshold between states of being. A particularly troubling entry, dated November 1897, reads, "I am now convinced that consciousness does not reside within the physical confines of the brain, but rather that the brain serves merely as a receiver, an antenna of sorts, for a consciousness that exists independent of physical form." The implications are staggering. If true, then death is not an ending, but merely a transition, a crossing of thresholds. The consciousness persists, only its vessel changes. This philosophical shift coincided with what appears to have been a traumatic incident in Whitmore's practice. An entry from October 1897, partially obscured by what seems to be deliberate ink blotting, references a patient, identified only as Subject D, who experienced an unusual recovery from near death. Subject D ceased respiratory function for approximately 7 minutes following severe crushing injury to thoracic cavity. No cardiac activity detectable via auscultation. By all conventional measures, clinical death had occurred. Applied electrical stimulation as per previous experimental protocol. Subject revived but exhibited profound alterations in personality, cognition, and linguistic patterns. Claims to have no memory of previous life but demonstrates knowledge of medical terminology and procedures never before exposed to. Most remarkably, subject accurately described my laboratory setup, including equipment in locked cabinets never viewed by the patient. This entry coincided with a period of increased mortality among Whitmore's patients, particularly those suffering from advanced respiratory conditions. County death records show 7 miners succumbed to lung ailments under Whitmore's care between October 1897 and January 1898, a rate significantly higher than the statistical norm for communities of similar size and industrial character. Subsequent entries document Whitmore's growing obsession with this theory and his attempts to prove it through what he termed empirical observation. The sheriff's report carefully avoids explicit details of these observations, noting only that they were of a nature so disturbing as to call into question the doctor's sanity and moral character. What we do know comes from cross-referencing county death records from 1897-1902 with mentions in Whitmore's journal. During this 5-year period, Blackwell Hollow experienced an unusually high mortality rate among patients diagnosed with respiratory ailments, predominantly miners suffering from coal dust exposure. While such deaths were not uncommon in mining communities of the era, the frequency in Blackwell Hollow was statistically anomalous. Neighboring mining towns with similar populations and working conditions recorded roughly half the number of respiratory-related deaths during the same period. More telling is that each patient death coincided with increasingly exultant entries in Whitmore's journal. One such entry from March 1899 states, "Subject F responded precisely as theorized. At the moment of transition, pupillary dilation was accompanied by a marked electromagnetic anomaly detectable via my modified galvanometer. The consciousness did not cease. It transferred. For 12 seconds following cardiac arrest, the needle oscillated in patterns identical to those observed during deep REM sleep in healthy subjects. Consciousness persists beyond physical termination." Whitmore's journal entries never explicitly describe his methodology, but certain references suggest he had constructed specialized equipment for his observations. He mentions modifications to standard medical instruments, including a galvanometer used to measure electrical currents, an electrocardiograph, and something he referred to as a consciousness transducer, a device of his own invention that supposedly could detect and measure the electromagnetic signatures of human consciousness. A detailed diagram dated January 1898 shows a complex arrangement of copper wiring, glass vacuum tubes, similar to those being developed for early radio technology, and a central receiving apparatus connected to what appears to be a modified telegraph recorder. Annotations indicate that the device was designed to capture and record consciousness wavelengths during the transition phase. By 1900, Whitmore's writings had become increasingly abstract and esoteric. He made repeated references to something he called the threshold protocol, apparently a methodology he had developed for what he believed would be his magnum opus, the empirical documentation of consciousness transference at the moment of death. The protocol involved careful preparation of the subject, precise timing of observations, and the use of various instruments to record what Whitmore believed were the electromagnetic signatures of consciousness as it transitioned from the physical body to elsewhere. An entry from October 1900 contains a diagram labeled Configuration Alpha, showing what appears to be a hospital bed surrounded by various instruments, with copper wiring connecting them to a central recording device. Annotations in Whitmore's hand indicate specific placement of electrodes on the subject's head, chest, and extremities, as well as the positioning of what he called resonant receivers at specific distances from the subject. As disturbing as these entries were, they paled in comparison to a passage dated June 1902, in which Whitmore first suggests a more active role in the process he had been observing. Passive observation has yielded valuable data, but the true test of the threshold theory requires intervention. If consciousness can be detected at the moment of transition, can it also be directed? Can its path be altered? The ethical implications are complex, yet the scientific imperative is clear. Knowledge demands courage. A subsequent entry elaborates. If consciousness is indeed electromagnetic in nature, then it should be subject to the same principles as other electromagnetic phenomena. It can be directed, focused, even captured, under the right conditions. The transducer has been modified accordingly. Initial tests using small electrical currents to stimulate specific brain regions in healthy subjects produce measurable alterations in consciousness signatures. The implications for directed transference are promising. In January 1903, just weeks before his disappearance, Whitmore wrote, "The final preparations are complete. I have refined the protocol through iterative observation. The mechanism of transference is now understood. What remains is to cross the threshold myself, not as observer, but as subject and observer simultaneously. The ultimate empirical experiment awaits." The journal ends there. No further entries were made. Following the discovery of the journal, Sheriff Hayes expanded his investigation to include Whitmore's patients over the preceding 5 years. Interviews with family members of deceased patients revealed a curious pattern. Many reported that their loved ones, in their final hours under Whitmore's care, had exhibited uncharacteristic behaviors and made statements that seemed out of character. Margaret Collins, whose husband died under Whitmore's care in October 1901, provided a written statement. James was never an educated man, having worked the mines since he was 14. Yet, in his final hours, he spoke with words I'd never heard him use about things he couldn't possibly have known. He described places he'd never been, using names of foreign cities I later had to look up in the encyclopedia at the town library. When I asked him how he knew these things, he looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize and said, "James doesn't know these things, Margaret." It was his voice, but the way he spoke, it wasn't him anymore. It frightened me deeply. Margaret further stated that in the weeks leading up to her husband's death, Dr. Whitmore had insisted on treating him in the laboratory behind his house rather than in their home or the company clinic, as was customary for seriously ill patients. She recalled that the laboratory contained strange equipment with glowing tubes and clicking devices that she had never seen before in a medical setting. Whitmore had explained them as advanced treatments from Europe, but refused to elaborate further when questioned. Similar accounts emerged from other families. William Hargrove, who lost his father to what was diagnosed as pneumonia in February 1902, reported that his father, a lifelong teetotaler and deacon at the local Baptist church, began speaking in a manner described as blasphemous and foreign to his nature while under Whitmore's treatment. He started talking about consciousness and energy and things no God-fearing man would concern himself with, Hargrove stated. He told me that death was just a doorway and that someone named Whitmore had shown him the key. When I mentioned this to the doctor, he just nodded and said it was common for the dying to become confused. Especially troubling was the testimony of Edith Monroe, whose 16-year-old brother had been treated by Whitmore for a lung infection in August 1902. According to Monroe, her brother recovered physically but remained changed in ways I cannot properly describe. She reported that he would sometimes stare vacantly for hours, and when questioned would respond with technical medical terminology he had never been exposed to. He started keeping a journal filled with diagrams of the brain and nervous system, Monroe stated. When I asked where he learned such things, he said, "Dr. Whitmore showed me from the inside." 3 weeks after his release from the doctor's care, my brother walked into the woods behind our home and never returned. No trace of him was ever found. A review of county records revealed that the Monroe case was not unique. Between 1900 and 1902, 5 residents of Blackwell Hollow were reported missing, under circumstances similar to that of Edith Monroe's brother. Individuals who had been treated by Whitmore for various ailments appeared to recover physically while exhibiting personality changes and subsequently vanished without explanation. In none of these cases had foul play been suspected at the time. The disappearances were attributed to the harsh environmental conditions, wild animal attacks, or simply the transient nature of some individuals in mining communities. Sheriff Hayes, faced with mounting evidence of something beyond ordinary criminal behavior, consulted with authorities in Charleston. The case quickly attracted the attention of state officials who dispatched a special investigator named Jonathan Crane to Blackwell Hollow in late February 1903. Crane's background remains somewhat mysterious. County records identify him only as a special consultant to the governor on matters of unusual concern. His correspondence, preserved in state archives, reveals a methodical approach to the investigation and a background that likely included both medical and legal training. In a preliminary report dated February 25, 1903, Crane wrote, "The Whitmore situation presents features that, while disturbing, fall within certain patterns I have documented in previous cases. The combination of medical authority, isolation, and vulnerable subjects creates conditions ripe for exploitation. However, the specific nature of Whitmore's apparent activities suggests something beyond conventional misconduct. References in other official correspondence suggest that Crane had previously investigated several cases involving unusual deaths or disappearances throughout the state, though details of these investigations remain classified. One cryptic note in the governor's records mentions Crane's particular expertise in matters where scientific experimentation exceeds ethical boundaries. The exact nature of this expertise and how Crane came to acquire it is not documented in available records. Crane spent 3 weeks in Blackwell Hollow interviewing residents, examining Whitmore's home and possessions, and consulting with medical authorities about the doctor's journals and theories. His investigation was thorough and systematic, involving cataloging every item in Whitmore's residence and constructing a detailed timeline of the doctor's activities in the months leading to his disappearance. His preliminary findings, submitted to the governor on March 18, 1903, described the Whitmore case as presenting elements that strain credulity yet cannot be dismissed as mere fantasy or delusion. The testimonial evidence, when combined with the documentary materials recovered from the subject's residence, suggests a sustained and methodical research program of a highly unorthodox nature, conducted without ethical oversight or institutional constraints. Crane focused particular attention on a locked cellar beneath Whitmore's home that Hayes had noted but not thoroughly investigated. Access to this space was concealed behind a false wall in the pantry, discovered only after Crane noted discrepancies in the architectural dimensions of the house. With proper equipment and assistance, Crane opened this space to discover what appeared to be a laboratory of sorts, one that married medical equipment with devices of unknown purpose. Among the items cataloged in Crane's inventory, a modified galvanometer connected to a series of glass tubes and copper wiring, a device resembling a primitive electroencephalograph, several jars containing preserved organic matter, later determined to be brain tissue, and most disturbingly, a chair fitted with restraints and positioned at the center of a copper circle inlaid in the stone floor. The circle, approximately 8 feet in diameter, was inscribed with symbols that Crane described as reminiscent of mathematical notations but arranged in a manner suggesting ritual significance. Photographs of the laboratory, included in Crane's report, show a space that combines elements of legitimate scientific research with configurations that defy easy explanation. The walls were lined with shelves holding medical texts, anatomical specimens in preservative fluid, and electrical components of various types. A workbench along one wall featured precision tools for instrument modification and repair. The central area was dominated by the copper circle and restraint chair, with various recording devices positioned at specific angles around the perimeter. Most notably, Crane documented a series of copper tubes embedded in the ceiling directly above the circle, angled inward to focus on the central point where the chair was positioned. These tubes connected to a complex apparatus housed in a lead-lined cabinet against the far wall, a device consisting of vacuum tubes, electrical components, and what appeared to be a modified radio receiver. The most significant find, however, was a second journal concealed within a lead-lined box beneath the floorboards. This journal, unlike the philosophical and theoretical writings found earlier, contained detailed procedural notes on what Whitmore called the protocol. Its pages included precise measurements, timing sequences, equipment settings, and observations recorded during what appeared to be a series of experiments conducted between 1899 and early 1903. Crane's report includes only selective quotations from this document, noting that much of it was unsuitable for inclusion in official records. What was included, however, paints a picture of something beyond ordinary medical malpractice or criminal intent. Whitmore had developed a conviction that consciousness could be directed at the moment of death. His initial experiments apparently focused on recording the transition, as he called it. Later, he became convinced that this transition could be influenced or even controlled under the right conditions. An excerpt from the journal dated April 1901 reads, "Configuration delta has proven most effective. The placement of the primary transducer at a 37-degree angle relative to the subject's pineal gland creates optimal conditions for signal capture. During today's observation, I was able to maintain coherent reception for 27 seconds post-transition, a significant improvement over previous attempts. The consciousness signature remained distinct and analyzable throughout." By 1901, Whitmore's notes suggest he believed he had successfully preserved aspects of his dying patient's consciousness through a process involving electrical stimulation and what he described as resonant frequencies unique to individual consciousness signatures. More disturbing were indications that he had begun attempting to direct these preserved consciousness fragments toward specific destinations. An entry from September 1901 states, "The vessel must be properly prepared. Preliminary conditioning via electrical stimulation of the temporal lobes creates a receptive state. When the donor consciousness is then introduced along the established frequency pathways, integration occurs more readily. Subject M's consciousness fragments were successfully transferred to vessel P with approximately 64% coherence. Post-transfer interview with P revealed access to specific memories exclusive to M, including the location of personal items unknown to any but the original consciousness. The implications of this passage, that Whitmore was attempting to transfer aspects of one person's consciousness into another's body, are too disturbing to dismiss, yet too fantastical to fully accept. Crane's report notes that while Whitmore's journals present these experiments as successes, no conclusive evidence exists that he achieved anything beyond inducing suggestion or confusion in already vulnerable patients. Nevertheless, Crane took the claims seriously enough to conduct interviews with several individuals identified in the journal as vessels, patients who had survived treatment by Whitmore and might have been subjects of his consciousness transfer experiments. These interviews, transcribed and included in the report as appendices, reveal consistent patterns of memory disruption, personality alteration, and acquisition of knowledge or skills without apparent source. One such interview, with a former minor identified only as Subject R in Whitmore's notes, includes the following exchange. Crane: "Do you recall your treatment by Dr. Whitmore in January of 1902? Subject R: "Parts of it. I remember the laboratory, the chair, the copper circle. The humming sound from the ceiling." Crane: "And after the treatment?" Subject R: "That's when things became confused. I started having memories that weren't mine. I could remember working as a physician in Richmond, specific patients, procedures, conversations. But I've never been to Richmond. I've never been anything but a minor." Crane: "Did you share these experiences with anyone?" Subject R: "Only once, with my wife. She became frightened and insisted I stop speaking of such things, said it wasn't natural. After a time the foreign memories faded, but sometimes, even now, I dream of surgical procedures I've never performed, of patients I've never treated." The final pages of the second journal outline what appears to be Whitmore's ultimate experiment, one in which he intended to serve as both experimenter and subject. He described a process whereby he would induce a controlled death state while connected to his apparatus, allowing him to cross the threshold with awareness intact, and then theoretically return. The last entry, dated February 11, 1903, one day before his disappearance, reads simply, "All is prepared. Tonight I become both the explorer and the territory. The threshold awaits." Whatever transpired that night in Whitmore's cellar laboratory remains unknown. No trace of the doctor was ever found, no body, no indication of flight, no evidence of foul play. The man himself had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Crane's investigation continued through April 1903, but ultimately produced no definitive conclusions. His final report to the governor recommended that Whitmore be declared legally dead in absentia, his property seized by the state, and his medical license posthumously revoked for gross violations of medical ethics and possible criminal actions against patients. More controversially, Crane also recommended that all documentation related to Whitmore's experiments be sealed and classified, citing concerns about the dangerous nature of the theories proposed and the risk of inspiring similar deranged pursuits in impressionable minds. This recommendation was accepted, and the Whitmore files were officially sealed by executive order in May 1903. For several years, the case faded from public attention. Blackwell Hollow gradually recovered from the scandal, though many families of Whitmore's former patients relocated, unwilling to remain in a community now associated with such disturbing events. The house on Ravens Ridge Road remained vacant, the property held in legal limbo. Local children reportedly avoided the area, claiming the house whispered after dark. While such claims can be dismissed as the predictable folklore that often attaches to sites of tragedy or mystery, what transpired in October 1908 is less easily explained away. Thomas Reed, a land surveyor contracted by the county to assess the Whitmore property for potential auction, spent 3 days documenting the house and grounds. His field notes, preserved in county records, are methodical and professional until the final day of his survey. The entry for October 12, 1908, begins normally enough, with measurements and observations about the structural condition of the house. Midway through, however, the handwriting changes subtly, and the content shifts dramatically. The resonant frequency of consciousness is not confined to organic matter, the text reads. It persists in structures, in objects, in the very air that surrounds the site of transition. I was correct in my hypothesis. The threshold can be crossed in both directions, though not without cost. The observer and the observed are not separate entities, a truth I now understand with perfect clarity. Graphological analysis conducted by the state police in 1962 confirmed what seemed apparent even to the untrained eye. The handwriting in the latter portion of Reed's journal bore striking similarities to that found in Whitmore's personal papers. The analysis report stated, while not identical, the handwriting exhibits numerous characteristic similarities in letter formation, spacing, and pressure patterns, suggesting either deliberate mimicry or the influence of one writing style upon another through prolonged exposure. The entry continues for several pages in this vein, using terminology and referencing concepts identical to those found in Whitmore's sealed journals, documents Reed could not possibly have accessed. The final lines read, "Thomas Reed is an inadequate vessel, but necessity dictates compromise. His consciousness now resides where mine once did, beyond the threshold. I remain, Elijah Whitmore." Reed was found unconscious in the cellar of the Whitmore house late that evening by a concerned colleague who went looking for him after he failed to return to town. The colleague, Samuel Dawkins, provided a statement to local authorities describing the scene. "I found Thomas sprawled on the floor of a hidden room I hadn't known existed. The space was circular, with strange metal inlays in the floor. Thomas was lying in the center, unresponsive but breathing steadily. His eyes were open but showed no recognition when I spoke to him. Most disturbing were his hands. They were positioned as if writing, though he held no pencil, and there was no paper beneath them. His fingers moved with purpose across the empty air." Upon regaining consciousness at the Blackwell Hollow Clinic, Reed had no memory of writing the journal entry, and more disturbingly, seemed to have lost all knowledge of surveying, the profession he had practiced for over 20 years. Dr. Frederick Morris, who attended Reed, noted in his medical report, "Patient exhibits profound dissociative symptoms. He recognizes neither his own name nor the faces of colleagues and family members." When questioned about his profession, he responded with detailed descriptions of medical procedures and anatomical structures beyond the knowledge of a layman. Most concerning is his insistence that he is not Thomas Reed, but rather a practitioner temporarily inhabiting an inadequate vessel. Reed's family reported that he was changed after the incident. His wife, in a statement to local authorities, claimed that Thomas looks at me like a stranger. He uses words he's never known, asks about books he's never read. Sometimes I catch him staring at his own hands as if he's never seen them before. Last night, I found him in the cellar of our home, drawing elaborate diagrams on the wall, circles and symbols I didn't understand. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was recreating the gateway. I don't know what that means, but it frightens me deeply. 3 weeks after the incident, Reed disappeared from his home in the middle of the night. A search party followed his trail through freshly fallen snow to the Whitmore house, where it ended abruptly on the front porch. Like Elijah Whitmore 5 years earlier, Thomas Reed had vanished without explanation. The tracks in the snow led directly to the porch steps, but did not continue. No footprints led away from the house in any direction. This incident prompted the county to take more decisive action regarding the Whitmore property. In December 1908, under the supervision of state officials, the house was demolished and all materials removed to an undisclosed location. Workers involved in the demolition later reported unusual occurrences during the process. Jacob Miller, a carpenter contracted for the job, stated, "When we tore up the floorboards in the cellar, the copper circle embedded in the stone beneath began to hum, not loud, but you could feel it in your teeth. 3 men quit on the spot. I stayed on, but I'll tell you true, I worked faster than I ever have in my life, just to be done with that place. The copper circle itself was removed intact and transported under guard to a state facility in Charleston. Its current whereabouts remain unknown, as all records regarding its disposition were classified, along with the other Whitmore materials. The property was declared unfit for development and converted to a county forest preserve, which it remains to this day. Local ordinances prohibited construction within a 1-mile radius of the former house site, though no official explanation for this restriction was ever provided. Official records of the Whitmore case were sealed by court order until 1958, when historical researcher Dr. Harold Perryman of Marshall University petitioned for access as part of a broader study of medical practices in Appalachian mining communities at the turn of the century. Perryman's academic credentials and the historical nature of his research provided sufficient justification for the court to grant limited access to the files, though certain documents, particularly Whitmore's second journal and Crane's complete reports, remained restricted. Perryman's initial academic interest in Whitmore as merely an example of medical malpractice evolved into something more focused as he delved deeper into the available documents. His research notes, housed in the Marshall University archives, reveal a growing fascination with Whitmore's theories about consciousness. Early entries maintain a skeptical, scholarly tone, dismissing Whitmore's ideas as pseudoscientific speculations typical of the pre-Freudian era. Later notes, however, show a marked shift toward considering the possibility that Whitmore might have discovered something genuine. An entry dated January 15, 1962, reads, "W's observations regarding electromagnetic signatures during neural activity preceded modern EEG research by decades. His postulation of consciousness as a wave phenomenon rather than a product of biochemical processes aligns with certain quantum interpretations of consciousness currently gaining traction in theoretical physics." The question becomes, if W was correct about these matters, might he also have been correct about consciousness transference? Perryman's notes indicate that he began conducting his own experiments in early 1962, using modified electrical equipment to measure what he termed ambient consciousness fields in locations associated with Whitmore. These experiments, which he described as preliminary and observational only, involved recording electrical activity at various sites, including the former location of Whitmore's house and laboratory. In the spring of 1962, Perryman traveled to the former site of Blackwell Hollow, the town having been abandoned following the closure of the mine in 1932, to conduct field research. He spent 2 weeks in the area, camping near the former location of Whitmore's house and conducting what he termed environmental readings with various scientific instruments. Perryman's field journal from this period shows a marked shift in tone and content. Early entries are objective and academic in nature, documenting soil samples, electromagnetic readings, and geological features. Later entries become increasingly personal and speculative. On April 19, 1962, he wrote, "Third consecutive night of the dreams. All was the same. I am in a circular room. Copper beneath my feet, instruments surrounding me. I am both observer and subject. I understand now what W meant by the threshold. It is not a physical boundary, but a frequency shift, a tuning of consciousness to a different wavelength. The methodology is becoming clearer each night." The final entry, dated April 23, 1962, reads, "The threshold is not a metaphor. It exists in the liminal space between states of being." Whitmore understood this. His error was in the methodology, not the theory. The transfer of consciousness requires no apparatus, merely the correct resonant frequency and a willing vessel. I can hear it now in the silence between my heartbeats, a whispering from beyond the threshold. Perryman returned to Marshall University following his field research, but, according to colleagues, appeared withdrawn and distracted. Dr. Eleanor Walsh, then chair of the history department, documented concerns about Perryman's mental state in a memorandum dated May 5, 1962. Harold appears significantly altered following his return from field research. He has abandoned his previously meticulous research methods in favor of pursuing what he terms direct experiential knowledge. I fear the isolation of his research site may have affected his psychological equilibrium. During yesterday's faculty meeting, he interrupted a budget discussion to announce that consciousness is not bound by neural architecture and that he had touched the threshold. When asked to clarify these statements, he merely smiled and said that Whitmore would understand. On May 18, 1962, Perryman submitted a manuscript to the university press titled The Threshold Protocol, Elijah Whitmore's Contribution to Consciousness Studies. The manuscript was rejected by the editorial board, who described it as incoherent and troublingly divorced from historical methodology. The rejection letter, preserved in university archives, specifically cited passages where Perryman appeared to be writing from personal experience about events that had occurred decades before his birth. One excerpt, quoted in the rejection letter, reads, "I felt the miners' consciousness separate from their failing bodies. I directed the electromagnetic signatures along prepared pathways. I preserved fragments of their being within specialized storage media. These are not metaphors or theoretical constructs. They are documented procedures I personally developed and implemented in Blackwell Hollow between 1897 and 1903. No copies of the complete manuscript are known to exist in university archives. The only remaining fragments are those quoted in the rejection letter and in Dr. Walsh's subsequent report to the university administration regarding Perryman's concerning behavior. 3 days after this rejection, Perryman resigned his position at Marshall University and withdrew all of his research materials related to the Whitmore case from the university archives. His letter of resignation, brief and typed on department letterhead, stated only that he was pursuing a more direct investigation into matters of consciousness that academia is ill-equipped to accommodate. Perryman's subsequent activities are sparsely documented. Records indicate he purchased property in McDowell County, approximately 30 miles from the former site of Blackwell Hollow. The property, a former company doctor's residence associated with the now-defunct Kingston Coal Company, had stood vacant for nearly a decade before Perryman's purchase. Local newspapers from the area contain occasional mentions of the eccentric professor who lived in isolation and was rarely seen in town. The McDowell County Register noted in its August 1962 edition that Perryman had ordered an unusual quantity of electrical equipment from a Charleston supplier and had arranged for significant upgrades to the power supply serving his remote property. Martin Fleming, who delivered mail to the area during this period, later recalled, "The professor was an odd one. Always polite when I'd see him, but there was something off about his eyes, like he was looking at you but seeing something else entirely. He received a lot of strange packages, heavy things in wooden crates marked fragile and scientific instruments. Once, when I was delivering a particularly large package, I glimpsed inside his front room. The walls were covered with diagrams, circles within circles, and writing I couldn't make out. He saw me looking and closed the door quickly, but not before I noticed a strange humming sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house." The final documented reference to Perryman appears in the logbook of the McDowell County Sheriff's Department, dated November 3, 1963. Deputy Samuel Weaver conducted a wellness check at Perryman's residence after a mail carrier reported that the professor's mailbox had not been emptied for several weeks. Weaver's report states that the house was found secure but empty. No signs of foul play or forced entry were evident. Perryman's vehicle remained in the driveway. His personal belongings appeared undisturbed. Food in the refrigerator had spoiled, suggesting an absence of at least 2 weeks. Most notably, Weaver documented finding Perryman's study in a state of careful arrangement. Books and papers were neatly organized on his desk, with a journal open to a blank page. A pen lay beside it as if ready for use. On the wall above the desk, Weaver noted an unusual diagram drawn in what appeared to be the occupant's handwriting, depicting concentric circles with various mathematical notations. The basement of the house contained what Weaver described as a makeshift laboratory featuring electrical equipment, recording devices, and a circular platform constructed of copper plates. Weaver noted that the equipment appeared to be in working order, with power still flowing to the various instruments. A chair positioned in the center of the copper circle showed signs of recent use, including what appeared to be restraint marks on the armrests. Weaver's report concludes, no indication of the occupant's whereabouts was found. No suicide note or evidence of self-harm was present. No signs of struggle or forced entry were observed. The residence appears to have been vacated in an orderly but unexplained manner. Recommendation: continue search of surrounding area and issue missing persons bulletin. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, no trace of Harold Perryman was ever found. No financial activity was recorded on his accounts following his disappearance. No sightings were reported. Like Whitmore and Reed before him, Perryman had simply vanished. The case was officially closed in 1964, with Perryman declared dead in absentia. His research materials found in his home were transferred to state archives and sealed under the same executive order that covered the original Whitmore documents. The property was sold at auction, with proceeds going to Perryman's sole surviving relative, a cousin in Ohio, who reported having had no contact with him for over a decade. Curiously, the new owners of Perryman's house reported abandoning the property after less than a month of residence. Their stated reason, according to county records, was unusual electrical phenomena and disturbing audio anomalies that made the house uninhabitable. The property remained vacant until 1972, when it was destroyed in a fire attributed to faulty wiring. For several decades, the Whitmore case remained largely forgotten, accessible only to those with specific knowledge of its existence and the authority to request access to sealed records. This changed in 1987, when true crime author Martin Gladwell began researching a book on unusual disappearances in Appalachia. Gladwell, whose previous works had focused primarily on conventional criminal cases, such as the Black Mountain Murders and the Charleston Strangler, stumbled upon references to the Whitmore case while examining state archive indexes. His request for access to the sealed documents was initially denied, but after a lengthy appeal process involving legal counsel and the intervention of several academic institutions, he was granted limited access to the case files in early 1988. Gladwell's notes from this research period, later published as an appendix to his book Vanishing Point: Unexplained Disappearances in American History, reveal a careful and initially skeptical approach to the Whitmore material. The case reads like a Gothic novel, he wrote, complete with a mad doctor and inexplicable events. My initial assumption is that much of what is recorded represents the superstitious interpretations of a less scientific era. This skepticism appears to have eroded as Gladwell delved deeper into the documentation. Later notes show increasing acceptance of the case's more unusual elements. By April 1988, Gladwell had shifted focus from merely documenting the disappearances to actively investigating Whitmore's theories about consciousness. An entry dated April 12, 1988 reads, "The consistency across independent sources is compelling. Hayes, Crane, Perryman, three investigators separated by decades, each initially skeptical, each gradually drawn to the same conclusion. Whitmore discovered something genuine about consciousness, something that challenges our fundamental understanding of human identity and continuity. The question remains, did he actually succeed in crossing the threshold, as he termed it? And if so, where or in whom does his consciousness now reside?" In June 1988, Gladwell traveled to the former locations of both Blackwell Hollow and Perryman's residence in McDowell County. His research assistant, Kevin Marsh, accompanied him on this trip. Marsh's account of the journey, provided in an interview for a 1995 documentary that was ultimately never completed, describes Gladwell as becoming increasingly agitated and obsessive as their research progressed. Martin had always been methodical, even detached in his approach to his subjects, Marsh stated. That changed with Whitmore. He began spending nights without sleep, filling notebooks with calculations and diagrams that had nothing to do with the book we were ostensibly researching. He started talking about resonant frequencies and consciousness thresholds, as if they were established scientific facts rather than the ravings of a discredited physician from the previous century. According to Marsh, Gladwell became particularly fixated on the idea that Whitmore's experiments might still be ongoing in some form. He kept saying that if consciousness could transfer between bodies, then Whitmore might still be active, moving from one vessel to another over the decades. He started seeing patterns and connections everywhere, claiming that certain phrases in Perryman's writings were directly lifted from Whitmore's journals, suggesting some kind of continuity between them. The situation came to a head on June 22, 1988, when the two men visited the former site of Whitmore's house in what was now the Ravens Ridge Forest Preserve. Gladwell insisted on camping at the site overnight, despite the area being officially closed to visitors after sunset. Marsh's account continues. We set up camp right where the foundation of Whitmore's house had once been. You could still see the outline in the ground and some stones from the cellar walls. Martin spent the evening taking readings with various instruments he'd brought, an EMF detector, a Geiger counter, even a modified EEG machine he'd somehow acquired. He kept saying the readings were significant, but wouldn't elaborate on what that meant. I fell asleep around midnight, with Martin still working by lantern light. When Marsh awoke the following morning, Gladwell was gone. His sleeping bag remained untouched. His notebook lay open beside the cold fire pit, a partial entry visible. The frequency is clearest between 3 and 4 a.m. It doesn't originate from any identifiable source, but seems to permeate the area. Not sound, something else. Felt rather than heard. Whitmore was right about the entry ended there, mid-sentence. A subsequent search by local authorities found no trace of Gladwell. His vehicle remained parked at the Forest Preserve entrance. None of his credit cards or bank accounts showed activity after that date. Like the others before him, Martin Gladwell had vanished without explanation. The investigation into Gladwell's disappearance uncovered something that previous investigations had missed, or perhaps deliberately overlooked. Among Perryman's sealed research materials was a small notebook containing what appeared to be a statistical analysis of unusual events within a 30-mile radius of the former Whitmore property. Perryman had documented 57 disappearances between 1903 and 1962, each sharing similar characteristics. No evidence of criminal activity, no body recovered, no explicable reason for the person to have fled or hidden. Most occurred within 1 mile of the Whitmore property, with frequency decreasing as distance increased. More disturbing was Perryman's observation that the disappearances seemed to follow a pattern. Clusters of activity, followed by periods of dormancy. The periods of activity correlated with specific astronomical and electromagnetic phenomena that Perryman had meticulously charted. According to his calculations, these conditions recurred approximately every 25 years. If his theory was correct, the window that had claimed Whitmore in 1903, Reed in 1908, Perryman himself in 1963, and now Gladwell in 1988 would next open in 2013. This finding prompted state authorities to reevaluate their approach to the Whitmore case. In 1989, all materials related to the case were transferred to a secure federal facility and classified under national security protocols. The Ravens Ridge Forest Preserve was permanently closed to public access, with signs citing environmental concerns rather than the true reason. Local residents reported increased activity in the area during the months following Gladwell's disappearance. Unmarked vehicles were observed traveling to and from the preserve. Security personnel maintained a perimeter around the property. Equipment consistent with geological survey operations was transported to the site. Officially, these activities were attributed to an environmental assessment related to potential contamination from the long-abandoned Blackwell mine. Unofficially, rumors circulated that federal authorities were conducting investigations into anomalous phenomena associated with the property. By 1990, the visible presence had diminished, though satellite imagery from the period shows the construction of a small research station approximately half a mile from the former Whitmore House site. This facility, not marked on any public maps, appears in aerial photographs until 2005, after which it is no longer visible, either removed or concealed by other means. For over 2 decades, the case remained locked away from public scrutiny. Then, in early 2013, in accordance with the 25-year window predicted in Perryman's research, federal authorities established a more substantial research team to monitor the Ravens Ridge area. This team, comprising specialists in fields ranging from quantum physics to parapsychology, was tasked with documenting any unusual phenomena that might occur. The existence of this research initiative would likely have remained unknown to the public had it not been for the events of April 2013, when Dr. Lisa Chen, the team's lead physicist, filed a report so concerning that it triggered an automatic review by oversight authorities. Chen's report, portions of which were later leaked to journalist Rebecca Santos, described detecting non-random patterns in quantum fluctuations within the monitoring area. These patterns, according to Chen, suggested a localized disruption in what we understand as normal space-time continuum properties. More alarmingly, Chen reported that team members stationed at the former Whitmore property were experiencing cognitive anomalies, temporary disorientation, gaps in memory, and, in 2 cases, brief episodes of personality discontinuity wherein the affected individuals spoke and behaved in manners inconsistent with their established psychological profiles. Dr. Chen's report specifically noted that these anomalies intensified during the early morning hours, particularly between 3 and 4 a.m., the same time frame mentioned in Gladwell's final journal entry 25 years earlier. During these periods, instrumentation registered what Chen described as coherent electromagnetic oscillations at frequencies typically associated with human neural activity, but at amplitudes far exceeding normal parameters. The most serious incident occurred on April 17, 2013, when research assistant Michael Collins was found unconscious at his monitoring station. According to witness statements included in the leaked documents, Collins had been working alone during the night shift when colleagues heard a high-pitched whine emanating from his station. Upon investigation, they found him slumped over his equipment, unresponsive but with eyes open and pupils fully dilated. Upon regaining consciousness 6 hours later, Collins exhibited severe retrograde amnesia, unable to recall his own identity or purpose at the site. Over the following days, his original memories gradually returned, but with them came what he described as overlapping memories that aren't mine. In a recorded interview conducted by Dr. Chen on April 20th, Collins stated, "I remember a medical practice in a mining town, patients with respiratory diseases, experiments conducted in a stone cellar. These aren't dreams or fantasies. They have the same quality and texture as my authentic memories. I can recall specific details, the weight of a medical bag in my hand, the smell of coal dust mixed with antiseptic, the sound of a modified galvanometer clicking as it registered something." Most disturbing was Collins's insistence that he could recall specific events from the early 1900s with perfect clarity. "I remember the night of February 11, 1903, he stated in the interview. "I remember activating the protocol. I remember crossing the threshold and observing my own body from outside it. I remember the sensation of consciousness untethered from physical form. These aren't second-hand accounts I've read. They're experiential memories. I was there. I was him." When questioned about who him referred to, Collins reportedly looked surprised and responded, "Whitmore, of course, Elijah Whitmore, but also Thomas Reed, and Harold Perryman, and others whose names we have forgotten." Following this incident, federal authorities terminated the research project and evacuated all personnel from the area. The entire region was designated a restricted zone, with satellite monitoring established to enforce the exclusion perimeter. The official explanation given to local authorities cited environmental contamination from abandoned mining operations. No public statement was ever made regarding the actual findings of the research team or the reason for the sudden withdrawal. Michael Collins was reportedly placed in a specialized medical facility for observation and treatment. No further information regarding his condition or whereabouts has been made public. Dr. C. Chen reportedly resigned from her position immediately following the termination of the project. Her current whereabouts and activities remain unknown. Attempts by journalists to locate her have been unsuccessful, and Freedom of Information Act requests regarding her subsequent activities have been denied on national security grounds. The most recent development in the Whitmore case comes from an unexpected source. In late 2018, a storage unit in Charleston, West Virginia was opened after the renter failed to make payments for 6 consecutive months. Among the abandoned contents, the facility manager discovered a collection of journals, scientific instruments, and audio recordings. The name on the rental agreement was Lisa Chen. The materials were turned over to local authorities who, upon preliminary review, contacted federal agencies. The contents were quickly classified and removed to an undisclosed location. However, before this occurred, the storage facility manager, Robert Dunham, claims to have reviewed portions of one journal and listened to one of the audio recordings. In an anonymous interview with an online paranormal investigation forum in early 2019, Dunham described the journal as containing complex equations and diagrams, alongside written entries that became increasingly disjointed over time. The earliest entries, dated April 2013, were structured and analytical, discussing quantum phenomena and consciousness theory in technical language. Later entries from October and November of that year became more personal and introspective. One passage, which Dunham claimed to have photographed with his phone before surrendering the materials, reads, "The threshold exists. I've measured it, documented it, observed its effects on others. What began as scientific curiosity has become something else. I dream of Whitmore's laboratory now. I can describe every instrument, every marking on the copper circle, every word in his journals, not because I've read about them, but because I remember creating them. Memory bleed-through is accelerating. I hear his voice in my thoughts. Sometimes I find myself writing in his hand." More disturbingly, Dunham described the audio recording as beginning with a woman's voice, presumably Chen's, calmly narrating experimental observations. Approximately 12 minutes into the recording, according to Dunham, the narration is interrupted by a period of silence, followed by what he described as a voice that wasn't hers anymore. Dunham's account states, "The new voice used the same mouth, the same vocal cords, but it wasn't the same person speaking. It was lower, measured, with this old-fashioned way of talking. It said something like, 'The threshold protocol is now complete.' After 115 years of refinement, consciousness transference has been achieved without loss of continuity. Whitmore's work reaches fruition through this vessel." Then there was some technical stuff about frequencies and neural pathways that I didn't understand. The recording ended with the voice saying, "The next phase begins. We are no longer bound by singular embodiment. We persist across vessels, across time. The threshold has been crossed in both directions." Dunham's interview was removed from the website within 24 hours of posting. Attempts by various journalists to contact him have been unsuccessful. The management company that operates the storage facility denies that anyone named Robert Dunham has ever been employed at any of their locations. The current status of the Whitmore case, if it can still be called that after expanding to encompass the disappearances of Reed, Perryman, Gladwell, and possibly Chen, remains classified. Freedom of Information Act requests regarding any aspect of the case are routinely denied on national security grounds. What began as an isolated incident in a remote West Virginia mining town in 1903 has evolved into something that spans more than a century and touches on questions far beyond the scope of conventional criminal investigation. Whether Elijah Whitmore was merely a deranged physician who committed crimes against his patients or something more, a pioneer whose work pierced the veil between established scientific understanding and something beyond, may never be known with certainty. What remains are the patterns, disappearances without explanation, journals that change hands across generations, and the persistent whisper of a theory too disturbing to be easily dismissed, that consciousness is not confined to the biological vessel in which it initially resides, that under certain conditions, in certain places, the threshold between one state of being and another becomes permeable. The implications of such a possibility extend beyond mere scientific curiosity. If consciousness can transfer between bodies, what does that mean for our understanding of identity, of continuity, of death itself? If Whitmore's theory is correct, if his consciousness has indeed persisted across decades inhabiting different vessels, then the fundamental nature of human existence requires reconsideration. Yet perhaps equally disturbing is a more mundane explanation, that Whitmore was simply the first in a lineage of researchers who became obsessed with a compelling but ultimately false theory. That Reed, Perryman, Gladwell, and Chen were not vessels for a transferring consciousness, but rather victims of a contagious delusion, a mimetic infection passed through journals and documents, through the power of suggestion and the allure of forbidden knowledge. Either possibility, that consciousness can transfer between bodies, or that the human mind is so susceptible to certain ideas that they can override identity itself, presents a profound challenge to our understanding of ourselves. The former site of Blackwell Hollow remains uninhabited. Satellite imagery shows forest reclaiming the land where a community once stood. The location of Whitmore's house is now marked only by a subtle depression in the earth, visible to those who know exactly where to look. No historical marker acknowledges what occurred there. No memorial commemorates those who vanished. Local residents report occasional government presence in the area, unmarked vehicles, personnel in civilian clothing carrying specialized equipment. Official inquiries regarding these activities are met with denials or references to routine environmental monitoring. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility suggested by Perryman's research that the 25-year window will open again in 2038. What might emerge from that opening, or who might be drawn into it, remains to be seen. In the meantime, the forests of West Virginia keep their secrets. The records remain sealed. And somewhere, perhaps, the consciousness that once belonged to Elijah Whitmore continues its exploration beyond the threshold, watching, waiting, and occasionally reaching back across the divide to continue the work begun in a small stone cellar over a century ago. What happened to Elijah Whitmore? Perhaps the better question is, where is Elijah Whitmore now? The answer may be closer than we care to imagine.